Hello and welcome to Leaders and Leadership, where we decode exemplary leaders and their leadership mantra. It's therefore only appropriate that we begin this series by looking at the most successful political leader in India today, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. We are going to examine him as a leader and his leadership style, not through a conventional Western lens, but through a native indic idea of leadership, through a framework employed by Dr. R. Balasubramanian, who is a scholar, activist, author, and member HR of the government's Capacity Building Commission. Power Within, the book that you see here, is Dr. Balu's painstaking research into the indic ethos of leadership and an examination of Narendra Modi as an individual, a politician, and a leader. Dr. Balu, welcome to Leaders and Leadership. Let me ask the most obvious question. Why did you pick up Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, as your subject for this book?
You know, actually, several years ago, when I was doing my research on understanding and appreciating what Indian knowledge systems can give us, I started doing it primarily because my stay at Harvard and then subsequently my work for the last 10 years, most of the background information that generally we get is from the westernized versions of leadership, to the point where people think that all leadership is a Western construct, whereas India is rich in leadership understanding, from our Mahabharata to the Ramayana to, you can take everything, whether it's our history, whether it's our Puranas, whether it's a scriptural wisdom, there's so much of leadership knowledge in it. So I was talking to my guru and guide, Swami Sureshananji, who was the Ramakrishna Ashram monk at that time. He passed away, and telling him and discussing with him these concepts, and I told him that I don't think the concepts embedded in our wisdom can actually be represented by any one human being. And so I just gave up the thought that we could even get one person who could possibly manifest all these qualities that I am discovering. And so I wrote a book then called Leadership Lessons for Daily Living, which is a series of people whom I picked up different traits that I was discovering the indic wisdom and wrote about them.
Okay.
So when I was discussing this, Swami Sureshanji said, I don't know much about leadership, but what my brother monks in the Ramakrishna mission have told me is the current, those days Narendra Modi ji was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. He said he is a Chief Minister there, and possibly if you do a study of his life, you might possibly get some information. He might be a person who could be one single exemplar. I thought, I am in Mysore, I am in a forest, how could I even reach out to him? So I just gave up the idea. I think fate willed otherwise. And so when I got appointed to the Capacity Building Commission, the commission reports to the Prime Minister and his HR Council. So it gave me an opportunity to see him in action, to appreciate him, to understand people who work very closely with him. And once I could, I saw that, okay, this is a story worth telling. And this person lives or embodies all the leadership constructs that I was discovering in my research. I thought this is something we should write about.
So that brings me to my next question, which is what are the core tenets of this indic leadership philosophy?
I think there are several. It's very difficult to just point out and say 8 or 10 of them. The primary basic concept is the Western world celebrates a leader. And so the whole theory of change for them is I am a leader, I have a vision, and so my followers will follow that vision. Whereas if you look at it very deeply from the Indian appreciation, it's not about putting a leader on a pedestal, but it's about the actions a human being performs, the act of leadership that he performs. And that act is celebrated. So it is about, it's not about Krishna as a hero that is celebrated, but the act of giving us the Bhagavad Gita that is celebrated. So as you go deeper into this, it's about these actions of a person. So leadership in the Indian construct is not about behaviors and traits and all that you have to get yourself trained on, but it is about how do you understand yourself, swadhyay. How do you use this understanding of yourself to understand others around you and the leadership actions that binds the self to the other. And that's something very special for the indic thinking.
Right. So now if we look at Prime Minister Modi as an individual and as a leader, I think no one will dispute the fact that one, he is not corrupt. Second, he works extremely hard. Third, which is very important from our Indian political context, is that he's not a family man, someone who's accumulating wealth for his family or putting his family members in positions of power. He's not doing that at all. So would you say, is that something, so in some sense he's a refreshing change from the conventional political leaders that Indian electorate has been used to. So would you say that, is that something that endears him to the Indian voters?
I think it's something much more than that. if you look at him, there is a very few people, at least I haven't, my research hasn't led me to believe that there is anybody that I have seen who consistently for the last 5 decades has held on to one single purpose or life's mission. A small crucible incident in his life that happened when he was a child, being inspired by that to serve mankind and holding on to it as a precious one. The manifestation of that service have altered or expanded, from a pracharak in the RSS to chief minister to prime minister, now looking at how do you handle the global challenges. That might expand, but this principal idea that I have to serve mankind, so and the attitude with which you serve, the seva bhav, I think that is unique and special, and everything else is what is seen by people. But the real core in me, in what I see him, is the humility with which he performs his actions. Though see, each one has a version of him, they have an opinion of him. I think in a polarized world that we live in, it's natural that he'll have a lot of critics, a lot of admirers. But I think the opportunity of doing a very objective research, I can say with the conviction of my studies of what he does and observing his life for 50 years, what drives him is this compulsive desire to serve.
Right, absolutely. So one of the things which Union Minister Dharmendra Pradhan mentions in this book of yours is also the fact that of all the leaders that he's interacted with, met with, he sees that the qualities of a Rishi and a Raj Rishi coexist in the Prime Minister. Now, these are in some sense very conflicting qualities. They don't usually reside in the same person. So how do you think Prime Minister Modi manages to resolve or harmonize these two qualities, conflicting qualities within himself?
I think if you look at the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna himself says it's always, we all have choices between the opposites, pleasure, pain, good, bad, etc. And Warren Bennis, the great leadership expert, he says it so beautifully in the context of leadership. He says the highest expression of leadership is the ability to manifest two contradictory thoughts together at the same time. And so I don't think Raja Rishi and Rishi are contradictory. I think Rishi is embedded in the context of learning to appreciate yourself and using your life for the advancement of mankind or society. The Raj comes when you are applying it in the context of ruling, or what King Janaka was. Though he was a king, he was also a real sense a Raja Rishi, because a Raja was living the life of a Rishi, and that's where the Raja Rishi word came. But a Rishi can also live the world of a Raja. Now, Prime Minister Modi is ruling the country. He is the Prime Minister, and therefore, in a Sanskritized way, we can say he is ruling the Raj, right? And he lives a life of a simple mendicant. And if you look at his assets, if you look at the lifestyle, if you look at his approach to thinking, if you look at his humility and his constant urge and desire to learn. So, a Rishi is always on the path of acquiring that illumination, that knowledge. It's a struggle to get it. And that simplicity and humility in acquiring knowledge qualifies him for that, and using that knowledge for the betterment of what he thinks a society in India, I think places him there.
So, one of the things which the Prime Minister often says is that Hamara kya hai ji, hum to jhola utha ke chal padenge. And when he says that, one doesn't really think that he's being specious, he really means it. So, this is a very unique quality of being attached, obviously very passionate about what he does, but at the same time a sense of detachment. Well, if this is it, I'm willing to walk away. So, again, that's a unique quality in him, isn't it?
I think it's very unique. I describe an entire chapter in the book where I try to sort of explain how leadership in action is real spirituality. When the aham is subsumed and it's always for the other, that's actually spirituality. Spirituality is what? It's a constant process of self-inquiry, asking yourself questions like, who am I, why am I born? Like Ramana Maharishi said, what am I doing? I have this position today, what do I do with it? And it just doesn't stop there. If you stay focused on the work at the center and don't make yourself the work at the center, that is a real subsumation of aham. And for a person like Prime Minister Modi, where I think the way I see it is everyday sadhana for him, a sadhana to recognize himself better and better, to evolve himself better and better. And this is more a spiritual journey rather than calling it a prime ministerial occupation. And to me, these are roles. All of us play different roles in life. I am a father, I am a son, I am a brother, I am a friend, people work for me, so I am a boss. So, different roles we play. But living our lives with the clarity of what role I am playing in what context is what is leadership evolution. And he, I think, is very clear. He understands that someday, today I am playing the role of the Prime Minister of the country, tomorrow I just go back to being Modi, or I can go back to being that constant seeker of truth, and I will just go seek it. So, I even think that these actions of his meditation are not just breaks to recharge, but essentially about reconnecting to the very purpose of what he thinks his life is all about.
True. And you also talk about abhaya or abhi, the quality of being fearless. Now, how much of that, in the case of Mr. Modi, do you think comes from his, what all these qualities obviously give him some sort of a moral, a higher ground from which he speaks and does things. So how much of that, his personal qualities of not being corrupt, not being a conventional politician in that sense, how much of that contributes to his being fearless when it comes to his decision making in terms of his, actions that he takes as a leader?
I look at the other way. I think this quality of abhayam in him is what gives him the strength to be what he is. And it's a very uniquely Indian concept. The Western world, in the world of leadership literature, talks of courage, talks of risk taking, and therefore if you're courageous, you take risks. But I think the Indian world is different. It doesn't talk of courage. Courage is the ability to renegotiate your fears. It's still there, but you're renegotiating it and still acting. Whereas fearlessness, in the way it's a Vedic thought, it's very powerfully repeated by Swami Vivekananda in his writings, and Jainism talks about it, Buddhism talks about it. And I think for Prime Minister Modi, in my view, embodies and lives it. As a spiritual evolution, when a person is evolving, you transcend fear itself. And when you transcend fear, that is fearlessness. There is an absence of fear, not in the sense of it's not there, you have transcended it. And when you transcend it, you are not really pulled down by the other nuances of, I did something wrong, so somebody is going to watch over me. The second attribute, and very important when you transcend fear, is a person's ability to live in the present. See, when does fear come? Fear comes in when you are either living in the past or into the future. You are afraid of what might come up, or you are afraid or guilty of something that happened in the past going to get exposed. When you are really not worried about the two and giving you 100% to the present, giving you 100% to what you are doing in the here and now, and I write about it in the book, The Power of Now, that he manifests, I think that gives you an enormous strength. It's an inner dynamo, and that fearlessness, I think, drives a lot of his actions.
Right. Now, one of the things which every leader needs is, of course, followers. But if you look at the way Mr. Modi has been able to bring together a diverse set of really talented, qualified people to espouse and rally around his vision, whether it's in India, whether it's abroad, it's simply phenomenal. You're an example yourself. How does he do that?
I think I again write this in the book. In fact, I asked him, and how does he pick the right people, and how does he even decide and look at that? I don't think, in my understanding of the Prime Minister, he doesn't look for followers. That would be a wrong way of putting it. He looks for collaborators. He looks for he looks for saharidayata. He looks for people who sahakaryata, who can go back, and the sahariday people can go do the sahakarya. So I think it's very unique. And he says three fundamental qualities which he described to me. He said first is that he needs people with absolute integrity. Now you can't, that's something very precious to him, and he thinks that's the most important, and that can also give fearlessness. Second, he says he looks for people who learn how to collaborate. For him, it's about a team India. It's not about I doing it for India, it's about all of us together. That's why a person like him can speak of Jan Bhagidari, where all of us come together to do something. It's not about just me or you, but all of us together. And the third, it's something very, I never thought a public leader would actually say that. He said a man who's not afraid of working with technology. Now, if you look at the Prime Minister, all the different initiatives he does, technology seems to be a very key embedded DNA of all his thinking. Whether it's quantum computing or it's just digital private public infrastructure, you can think of anything that he's been doing about, there'll always be technology in it, or Gati Shakti. So I think three qualities he looks for, and these qualities don't happen. You can't pretend. These are part of your DNA, whether it is integrity or whether it is ability to collaborate. So he says, "Mai nahi hum." That's the greatest thing that he wants. None of us should even think that I am doing it. We are all doing it together, and that's something he really values.
Right. Now, India is a large, complex country. To bring about any kind of change in this country is extremely hard for any leader. But I think very few people will dispute the fact that as a nation, our psyche, our psychology has been reset. We are now a far more confident nation. We take pride in ourselves. Even when we go abroad, there's a certain perception with which people now look at us, at the Indian passport or the Indian people. How do you think Mr. Modi has been able to bring this about?
I think that's something very powerfully done by him over the last decade specifically, much earlier also, but in a smaller context, but last decade because of the national context. He is one who could connect that India cannot really emerge without the civilizational foundations that it should rest on. I think he appreciated that you can't build a great future for this country without really going back and understanding your past. Not that you have to repeat your past, but understanding it. There might be things which are not repeatable, and that is very clear to be thrown out. but the good things, the civilizational wisdom that we carry, how do you translate and transact in a world which is contextually relevant to the future. So, I think this enormously unique quality of creating pride, that garv, and not in an arrogant way. So, everything Indian. Now, I remember what Swami Vivekananda writes in one place. He says, if you teach a child goes to high school in India, he must have talking more than 100 years old, the context is different. He says the only thing they learn is to hate India, everything India is bad, everything else outside is great. And that is the mindset most of us grew up in, right? Because decolonization is not just signals, it's also about a deep sense of appreciation of India. I think he brought it back. So, Bharat is not just a semantic, Bharat is an emotional way you describe your mother country.
How would you compare Prime Minister Narendra Modi with someone like, let's say, an Atal Bihari Vajpayee or even Mahatma Gandhi?
I think each leader had great qualities and they were all in particular context. Now, the context have altered dramatically. Today's world is completely different. In the book I write about it. He's got that earthy groundedness of Gandhi, as well as the intellectual poetic nature, which he doesn't possibly demonstrate enough in public, but in private we know. Like I've always been wondering, in private his sense of humor is remarkable, but in public everybody looks at him as a very stern person, and I even asked him this once, how is it? I am not able to reconcile it. So, I think he is able to capture that soft sway, finesse of Vajpayee, at the same time the earthy groundedness of Gandhi. He is very clearly aggregated a lot of it. He's picked a lot along his life from various people, from Vakil Saab, Inamdar from the RSS, whom he actually started his life as a Swayam Sevak, to reading books by Madhav Rao on administration, to Benjamin Franklin's works, and constantly asking people, which book should I read next, what is it, can you tell us what is the essence of this book. That spirit of self-seeking and lifelong learning that is done for the last at least 50 years that I have done research on, I think all that makes him appreciate that leadership is always in context.
So, in your book you say that he actually wanted to be a monk, and the reason why he went to Ramakrishna mission was also to join the ranks and become a monk, but he was told not to by one of the Swamijis. So, tell us about that.
See, I think he was a restless young man, and the gap in his life is 17 to 19, when I won't say gap, when I think that changing point, that pivoting point was 17 to 19, when he just decided to travel around the country, understand himself. In indic thinking, there's a very powerful concept called darshana. Darshana is not just traveling around and seeing places, it's not just pilgrimages. There's a deeper darshana. Darshana is an opportunity, the external expression is going around and trying to understand what is outside you, but it's an opportunity for you to get deep dive into yourself and have the real inner darshana. I think that's what happened to him in those 2 years in the Himalayas, elsewhere. In part of his journey, Rajkot is what he went to first, and Swami Atmasthananji, who later on became the head of the entire mission, he's just passed away, was there, and he said, you're not even a graduate. So, in the Ramakrishna mission, if you're not a graduate, you're not allowed to enter. So, he went around, and I think he said, I'll become a graduate and come back, but his travels took him around. Again he went to Belur Mutt, he tried the same thing. They said, you're still yet to acquire a graduation, went to Advaita Ashram, spent time in the Himalayas, and later on, once he graduated, started going regularly to Rajkot Ashram, and Swami Atmasthananji was still there, and he finally told him, now I'm ready, now I want to be a monk, I want to serve India. I think that's when he said, and Atmasthananji in the ashram circles is regarded as a seer saint and who could understand it. He said, no, you're not destined to be a monk. Being a monk, you might work for your moksha, but what you're destined for is something more bigger and important. And so you have to really give your life to service a larger cause, and that's India's cause.
So, there aren't too many setbacks that Prime Minister Modi has faced, in his political career as a Prime Minister, at least of this country. But I think one of the big setbacks, I would say, was his inability, or the government's inability, to convince farmers on the goodness of the Farm Law Bill. And he himself said in his speech that we somehow failed to convince you of the goodness of this bill. How did he handle that bit, despite being such a great orator? How did he handle that setback?
So I think this is my appreciation. I think somebody has to really ask him this, and I haven't had the courage to do so yet. So for him, I think it was not a setback. It is a great learning experience, and you would always look back and say, what could we do better maybe in the next time to make sure I communicate properly? What is it that I didn't do properly? And look at his greatness. If he had been, some people project him as a very tough, arrogant, egoistic person, which is completely untrue. A person's leadership driven by self-consumption and self-driven ego would have said, nothing doing, I am the Prime Minister, we have decided with this, we are not going to go ahead with it. He still has a power and authority. He could have just put people down and said, I am going ahead with the law. And he really believed the law does good. And if you're a neutral policy analyst, which I am, and when I did it, I think that brought in real great agrarian reforms to this country. It's a missed opportunity. Whatever happened later on is different, but it was a missed opportunity for the country. He simply said, we must have not done our jobs properly. We didn't communicate to farmers how good it will be. So it's our mistake, and he apologized. Now coming out there and saying, I'm sorry, apologizing to them and saying, maybe we didn't understand what your needs are, and we'll come back to the drawing board and think it better and then come back to you, I think takes courage, and that is what leadership is all about.
Now, India is a democracy, which means that everyone has a say in everything. And often, like we saw with the Farm Bill, even if something is good, people may reject it. So what is a leader supposed to do in that sort of a situation?
I think unless one way of, in a very pedantic way, develop thick skin, but in a deeper way, you got to understand what I have written about concept of setapragnate. Now, Swami Vivekananda says it so beautifully. He says, if you can be attached while being detached, and detached while being attached, it's very difficult to appreciate the sentence. So you got to be attached to the karma and detached enough to be a karma yogi, and then these things will not really, this opposite will not affect you. And that space of the experience of oneness that he has, at the same time that equanimity that he brings in, which doesn't, these things don't disturb him. He'll just move on and say what else should be done and how can it be done better. It's not easy for us. Many of us, we get ruffled, something doesn't happen the way we want it. If what I like does not happen, I'm disturbed. If what I like happens, I'm very happy. We don't know how to deal with the opposites when we are challenged. But the only way you can do it is when you can maintain that setapragnata, and I've written about it.
What would you say are maybe some of the most defining moments or actions of Prime Minister Narendra Modi over the last, let's say, 10 years? I can think of many. I can think of...
I think there are several. It's very difficult to box it down or prioritize them. But what I'm impressed, most of my training, formal training at Harvard comes in the space of adaptive leadership. And we look at the world is so complex, the problems are so wicked, and the crisis of COVID was enormous. The way he mobilized citizens, obviously people make fun of, what will happen if you bang plates or you light candles. What they don't understand is the candle is not driving away the virus. It is, banging plates is not frightening the virus. It is a sense of coming together, mobilizing communities, mobilizing
just like Gandhi's
people.
charkha.
Yes, if you look at definition of leadership, and I use one of those definitions here, I say leadership is an activity. It's not about being a leader, it's about doing something. It's an activity of mobilizing yourself and people around you for doing something constructive amidst enormous uncertainty. COVID was the most uncertain time, and people had to be mobilized. Fear was there. He provided sustained presence. So whether it was Chandrayaan-2 didn't achieve what result that it should have achieved, or when it achieved in Chandrayaan-3, you will see him very equanimous. At the same time, Chandrayaan-2, you went back and hugged our ISRO chairperson and gave them a wonderful, inspiring speech and said, it's the learning that matters. That is him. That's the real him.
If we look at, Mr. Modi, he's transformed from a young RSS pracharak to a chief minister with absolutely no political, kind of a background at that time. Then he came to Delhi again with no Delhi credentials. Then he's gone on to become a well-loved leader on a global stage. I mean, there are political leaders around the world envious of his popularity at a time when politicians are physically under attack. What do you think has made this transformation, this evolution of Mr. Modi possible over the last 30 years?
I think the string around, if I can call it that, is this tremendous urge of self-discovery and aligning it to the purpose that he's got. His purpose, like Vivekananda says it again, today you started serving, let's say, a small set of people, your family or your village, and it has to concentrically expand, he says. So real life is expansion, and so he is expanding his ability to reach out to people, and today it's reached possibly a very high level of expression. And his conviction, there are 2-3 qualities I noticed in him. In indic thinking we call shreyas and preyas. In the typical policy world we say short-termism and long-termism. Both are important. If you are not short-term thinker, you can never win an election. If you are not long-term in your approach, the country can never develop. He is one of the few leaders globally today who has found the perfect equilibrium between what is short-termism and long-termism. He can still give away 80% of the population free rice, at the same time make sure that our roads are built and parliament also happens. So this ability to do both is very, very rare and not getting carried away by it. And the other rareness amongst global leaders is something very powerful, and Chanakya writes about it, and it's Indriya Vijaya. It's control of your senses. And that is a dharma. the last chapter I talk of dharma of legacy and legacy of dharma and what the world can learn from it. It is yogakshema is what matters to him, lokasangraha is what matters to him, and that can happen only when the leader has got indriya vijaya, as what Chanakya says, and he manifests it.
Nice.
More than 60% of the world is having elections today. Tell me how many countries, how many global leaders has gone into an election, not talking about the electoral cycle of what I will do 5 years alone, which is a mandate, any manifesto, but has the courage and conviction and the knowledge possibly. He may not live for 25 years doing that, saying that I am strategically planning for what this country needs for 25 years. No leader in the world has had the strategic vision to talk about their country in such long-term thinking.
True.
Now, that's what makes him different.
So, if you were to compare Mr. Modi with some global leaders, who do you think would come closest to him or what he's been able to do? What are some of the names that come to your mind?
So, I would say different attributes of his. Some of people come close. For example, his communicating abilities, I can say Angela Merkel or Obama or people who could do it very well. But as a watershed moment in their countries or civilizations, the leaders we are going to compare, I have actually compared 3. I am not saying they are
exact comparison.
And it's also not the only 3.
Yeah.
These are extraordinary people in their own countries. Abraham Lincoln in the US context, it was a very shifting moment for the country, and his legacy is still there. Right. His legacy of whether it is fraternity, equality, or saying the color distinction should go away. It might not have gone away, but still he started that watershed movement, and he really somebody who can be credited to be a great leader of that country. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, the way he changed the destiny of his country from what it was to what it is today, and his style was different. You can't say that's his style or this is their style, but he shifted the narrative of his country. Deng Xiaoping in a closer China, civilizationally shifted it. A communist country, a huge shift. A cat by whatever name is a cat, he said, black or white, and so his country shifted. I think they were all very, very appropriate in the context in which they operated. Right. But how Modi is different, he is not only contextually relevant for India, for the whole world, but clearly, if you are other 3 models of the countries they initiated actually enlarged and expanded consumption. It is unsustainable.
Right.
And if you look at his model, whether he calls it life or he says the 4 P's in the Delhi Declaration, is all about control of external nature along with the personal responsible control of internal nature, where dharma is the connecting force.
Right.
Artha, moksha, kama are important. Without aspirations, young people will not do things. Without artha and earning money, you can't really take everybody's lives inclusive and remove hunger and poverty. Yeah. And you need the higher aspiration of wanting to realize myself. But he says the underpinning foundation has to be dharma, righteousness. Right. Yeah. And that is what his model is all about.
So, one final question, Dr. Balu. What do you think the youth of India ought to learn from Mr. Modi?
I think there are several things. Sometimes when you have a role model, you will feel overwhelmed that you can't be that. That's what people kept talking about Gandhi. But I think the difference of enormous difference is Modi gives hope for people to say that if you work hard, if you ensure that you are disciplined enough, if you clearly focus on the vision that you want to achieve for, and if your vision is beyond yourself, a larger vision that is not constrained by your selfish desires, but expanded by the selflessness of the desire itself, you can actually get to where one can get. Otherwise, how could you imagine an ordinary tea seller with the kind of barriers to entry in politics in India come up all the way to be the Prime Minister, and a much loved Prime Minister? And those approval ratings are not just numbers, right? When people, he walks on the street, the love that people show is very different. Whatever the politicians might say, that is different, but what he is as a person, that kind of emotions you can capture. So I think what people can learn from them is, if I have a purpose, if I stick to my purpose, nothing else but my purpose, and do the hard work, the discipline to achieve it, I can also succeed. Right. That's the most powerful message you can give. Right.
So thank you very much, Dr. Balu, for being on this show, Leaders in Leadership. And I hope our viewers will want to pick up this book.
It's pre-order on Amazon right now.
You can pre-order on Amazon, as Dr. Balu said. So with that, thank you very much for joining us on Leaders in Leadership.
Thank you.